Hello and welcome to Kopi with DBS Research, a podcast series on economies and global markets. I am Taimur Baig, Chief Economist of DBS Group Research, your host for the next 30 minutes. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce our very first guest, Bert Hoffman. Bert is the Director of East Asian Institute at the National University of Singapore, which he joined last June. Earlier, Bert was the World Bank's Country Director for China, Mongolia, and Korea, based in Beijing. I cannot think of a better person to talk about the ongoing situation in China, so welcome to the show, Bert.
Pleasure to be here.
Bert, let's begin with the most obvious case, the coronavirus episode, the COVID-19 spread. It's been commanding the global headlines for the last few months. No sign of respite yet. Hopefully down the road, things will get better. What's your sense of the situation stemming from China, but also perhaps extending to the global economy?
Well, first, of course, this is a humanitarian hit, and it's very sad for the people that died, and it's quite stressful for the people that are affected, and that is by now many. More than 70,000 are sick, and the whole of China is really affected. It's no longer a Wuhan problem. It's no longer a Hubei problem. Even that is still the epicenter, but it is the whole of China, and of course. Here in Singapore and some other countries, we also affected, and we're under measures to contain any possible outbreak, which is working well, but it's largely a China problem. So, in terms of the economics, clearly we've seen a major delay, if you want, in the restart after the China New Year. That is really what we're looking at economically. Of course, Wuhan started earlier, Hubei started earlier, but really for the rest of the country, it is the after the Spring Festival restart, which hasn't really happened yet. And if you look at the numbers, really look in terms of traffic, in terms of energy use, in terms of individual industries, on how far are they along in restarting, it's more than 2 weeks delay compared to what you see normally. So that will, of course, have an impact. There's lots of speculation how large that impact will be, and the ranges are very, very large. Personally, I'm somewhat on the more pessimistic side, given how big this is, given how much stronger the measures were compared to the episode of SARS in 2002 and 2003, where, yes, there was an economic impact, but there was a sharp decline in 2003 quarter one, sharp uplift in 2003 quarter two. That's now probably a little different for a couple of reasons. One, the measures are a lot stronger. Two, the economy relies a lot more on services. And of course, in manufacturing, yes, you run double shifts, you work over the weekends in order to catch up. That now is less possible because service is now more than 50% of GDP. So the rebound is probably going to be less sharp than before. But three, the whole intricate web of the global supply chain, which is in part in China, but in part around the region and the world, seems to be affected as well. And how that rebounds, that this is, if you want, almost the first time that we see that. Yes, there was the Thai floods, which is comparable, but that was only really the car industry. This is a far broader impact on those global supply chains. And as I said, a lot of it is playing out in China. So it's a long-winded way of saying we don't really know, but I see compared to SARS, this is probably going to be a stronger impact.
It seems to me that the global markets are trying to look entirely past the ongoing episode. We've seen a few stocks around the hospitality industry and travel industry getting affected. Apple gave the markets a bit of a scare yesterday. But other than that, by and large, markets seem to be very well supported. We've seen fixed income assets rally in expectation of monetary easing. But equities seem to think firmly that there's a V-shaped recovery just around the corner, and therefore we should not worry too much. Your point, which is that the services are such a big driver of growth now, and that being suspended for a few weeks or a month is almost like a deadweight loss. It's not going to come back. I feel like that is not being fully appreciated by the market so far.
Yeah, I think you're right there. That's the one factor that we don't see reflected in markets. But second, this supply chain, and Apple is the tip of the iceberg. And Apple was maybe so reliant on what's happening in China. But many companies are, of course. Also regionally, if you look at regionally, it's amazing how much larger China is compared to 2003. Not just in exports and imports, but also in their position in the global supply chain. Take Vietnam, almost half of their exports depends on Chinese imports. Singapore, similarly, quite vulnerable to inputs coming from China. Otherwise, they would not be able to export. So it's not just the demand effect from China, and that is obvious because China is the second largest economy in the world, but it's also the inputs that you get from China to make your own stuff and export it elsewhere. So I think we only see that news coming in gradually, as of course the if you want the stocking up for the Chinese New Year is starting to run out in the manufacturing around the region.
So you would expect in the course of the month of March an emergence of parts shortages around the world?
Yeah, maybe even earlier.
Maybe even earlier. What about the offsets? For example, the Chinese, yes, they consume a lot of services, but they consume a lot of e-services. So shouldn't we expect some offset from a pickup in gaming and e-commerce and so on?
Well, yes. And of course, it's remarkable what happened in China with Alibaba and Tencent, and we're all in awe, but it's still only 25% of retail. So yes, it will have a somewhat more positive effect. And even some of these people that run around on their motorbikes in Beijing, they're not there, or they're not allowed to move. Or it's become harder to also buy online. A big part of consumption is consumer durables. And if you look at car sales, they're on the bottom. If you look at housing sales, they are completely flatlining at the moment, and you don't see much of a recovery yet. So the big items, if you want, that go into consumption, you see very little movement.
Now, I don't want to corner you into coming up with a specific forecast for Q1 or Q2 or for the whole year, but would you give us a sense of how big the downside is?
Well, I mean, I think the downside is very big, but if I sort of think about how big this can be, without counting on actions from the government, which of course are happening, but if I look at very roughly at the numbers, and I do it very roughly, I'm no longer in banking, I'm in academia, but you know, having a decline year on year, Q1, should be quite natural, and that can go down to say 10% decline. If that were to happen, and you see a rapid bounce back, sort of a SARS-type bounce back, plus 10 second quarter, and then, like last year, you would end up with 4.6% over the year. That, to me, sounds more reasonable than the 5.5, 5.6, 5.3 that I read with a lot of the investment banks. So a sharper decline and a not so rapid recovery as many assume will bring growth below 5%. How much measures you can then take and how much measures actually make sense then becomes the big question. So that's the policy question.
Right. So I think that at this juncture, consensus is around 0.5% of GDP downside for the year with a very sharp V-shaped recovery in mind. So a month ago, people were looking at 5.8, 5.9 for the year. People are now saying something in the range of low fives. Your fear is that it could be substantially lower than that.
My ex ante ex post would be more like 1% or deeper.
Very well. That, of course, brings us to the policy response side. We have seen PBOC make some moves in the last few weeks. Surely fiscal actions are coming. What's your sense? What's the thinking out there?
Well, you say fiscal actions are coming. It's actually not that clear. First, the finance minister came out with a bit of a mixed message. Yes, there have been some further reduction in tax burdens and social security contributions. At the same time, he did not promise an all-out effort. Neither did the People's Bank, of course. Right now, the government's a bit of a bind because pouring a stimulus over an economy that is still frozen because nobody can move doesn't make that much sense. So if you want, the measures would really have to start kicking in a bit later. The one measure that does help now is to try and prevent companies from toppling because they're running out of cash flow, especially the smaller enterprises. And so giving them a bit of liquidity, some regulatory forbearance on the loans outstanding would help. And what would also help is wage subsidies. Keep people on the payroll rather than companies firing people, and then it becomes hard to restart, say, when the economy revives again. So there's a couple of measures they can take now, but not that much. Then the question is, well, does it make sense to push for a lot of stimulus later in the year? The way I read the signals is there will be some, but there won't be an all-out stimulus. So that, again, that gives you some recovery, but it won't be a V-shaped recovery added by the stimulus, as far as I can see. Also, there's other problems. There is problems of debt that haven't gone away. The fiscal side of things is quite interesting because the finance minister has been quite generous in giving tax reductions in the past couple of years. It also means that many local governments just don't have the money anymore, and it would really cut into their spending if you give further tax reduction. A lot of local governments would have to cut their spending, and therefore on net you won't make much of a stimulus. So the stimulus would have to find a different shape than, say, the one of last year and the one the year before.
It's interesting you say that. In the last few weeks, we have been looking at the credit space in China, and the market has been treating the Chinese corporate borrowers in a differentiated manner. Companies that are in the retail transportation sector, their spreads have widened. Companies that are attached to state-owned enterprises, their spreads have actually narrowed in expectation that there'll be lots of support coming in the manner of fiscal or monetary. So when you paint a fairly stark picture of the constraints from the debt side, from the revenue side, I think that makes things a little more realistic and a little more challenging for the outlook. It is, however, extraordinary, Bert, I have to say. If you were to ask me a month ago that a pandemic would cause spreads to narrow, I would have found it very hard to believe, but we're seeing that take place right now.
Yeah, well, it's the eternal blessing of liquidity that banks see as a positive, and frankly, I think it does go against the more structural reforms that are facing China, and of course, there's a reason to do some and to keep companies alive. That's a very sensible approach. Was widely done during the global financial crisis, which was, it was different, but nevertheless a very sharp decline, and there was a lot of liquidity provided, a lot of subsidies in Europe, a lot of subsidies for wage earners, but so China faces these problems, and they can't kick the can down the road too much, I believe.
Sure. We saw Singapore's budget earlier this week where the government took very targeted approaches, support for the transportation sector, support for the hospitality sector. The Chinese government in the past have shown a proclivity toward also micro measures, targeted measures. So if we don't expect a broad-based fiscal relaxation in the form of, say, tax cut, but targeted sectoral or industry-specific measures, can you expect that?
Well, there's definitely a lot of industries lobbying at the moment, and especially airlines and the transportation sector. Some of them are state-owned, and they probably have, or most of them are state-owned, and probably won't have that much of a problem. Some of the big airlines and a lot of the transport, especially train transport and bus transport. But in the broader logistics sphere, some targeted help can help. But maybe the regulatory forbearance that I talked about, maybe banks telling their customers don't pay back yet, might just be sufficient. And said for that you need the liquidity, otherwise the banks run out of liquidity. So for that you need the liquidity. I think the People's Bank is providing that.
Right. And in terms of general crisis response, you alluded to how the Western governments reacted during the GFC. We talked a little bit about the context of the Thai floods and SARS and so on. So when you see a short-term shock, and hopefully this is a short-term shock, the overall public policy idea is not to go for big bang measures, but targeted measures, and hopefully that's sufficient. In the context of China, one fear that I have is that because of the high debt problem, some companies which are sort of teetering on the edge of a solvency crisis may have to be nationalized now. Do you share a concern like that?
It's one of the policy options, and as you see, maybe de facto some of that may happen because, as you mentioned, the state enterprises look the strongest of all the enterprises, and therefore they may say this is a good time to buy. I don't necessarily see that as a policy direction, but there might just be some opportunistic buying by state enterprises of private enterprises, going not in the right direction as far as I can see, not in the right direction as far as the overall policy is concerned.
Now, Bert, we now have the COVID-19 episode. A month ago, we were talking about the phase 1 deal. U.S.-China rivalry continues. U.S. is pushing back China on many, many fronts. Xi Jinping ostensibly is a very powerful leader, but he certainly has his share of challenges. Is this a virus episode an opportunity for him to assert or reassert his strength, or you think this actually puts him in a further weaker position?
Well, I think first of all, he thought that he had some explaining to do, because most recently in a very prominent Communist Party journal, he published an article where he explained that actually he was already involved very early on. It's quite exceptional. It was almost like telling the world, well, it's not that I was aloof, I was working, but it's just some people didn't do their job afterwards. By itself, that is an interesting observation. Look, so obviously the State Council, the Politburo, knew quite early on that there was something wrong in Wuhan and Hubei. And then the question was, so why wasn't there sufficient action taken? Part of it was political, part of it was local, but some of it may have been central. Maybe there wasn't sufficient information to make all the decisions there. But the fact is that there is a window of delay, you would say. I mean, there's a local window of delay between, say, December 31st, when these 8 doctors come out and say there's something really going on that looks like SARS. We don't quite know what it is, but it's spreading. And that's one window of delay where Wuhan basically tries to suppress it. And then between January 7th, where there is this standing committee of the Politburo meeting, and January 23rd, when basically Wuhan gets locked down. In those 2 weeks, you see an explosion of the cases. So there's a reasonable argument to say, well, if they would have reacted faster, if the measures would have been stronger, at least as far as Wuhan is concerned, some of this could have been prevented. I think we're going to talk about this for a long time. Also, what it then means for the position of Xi. You said that the trade war, if you want, damaged him. I'm not so sure whether that has necessarily been the case, because in part it revamped nationalism in China, and Xi has been using that nationalism, if you want, to pursue his own goals. But this situation is a bit more trickier. And one very interesting sign I felt was that it was Li Keqiang that was made the head of the leading group on the control of the coronavirus, whereas Xi Jinping is basically the leader of all the other small leading groups in China. So that can be opportunistic, i.e. this is too difficult for me to deal with, I give it to Li Keqiang, but it can also be a first step in devolving some of the power. I mean, if you are in charge of everything, you are in the end also responsible for everything, even if you cannot possibly be responsible for everything. So there may be a bit of a different leadership style going forward, and that might be healthy for China.
But in terms of regional leadership, where we have seen a few departures and firings in the last few weeks, for the new generation or the new crop of leaders, should they be more conservative in terms of reporting all these outbreaks and really slow things down? I mean, firing people in the middle of this crisis, is that a good idea or a bad idea?
It's very interesting that it happens in the middle of a crisis, and there must have been a good reason for that. It would be great if we can read it at some point. But the signal for many of the local leaders is to err on the very conservative side. That's why, in part, from an economic point of view, I am less optimistic than many in the market, because I see that political aspect. And yes, President Xi has come out saying, well, look, we really have to restart the economy. But a lot of local leaders would say, yeah, sure, but if something goes wrong, then I get the blame and I get fired. So I better still focus on this coronavirus. And you see the measures, if you look at the local measures taken, they still are more and more restrictive in most areas. I don't read too many areas where there's a very strong promotion of restarting the economy, except for a few small county level cities that try to bus in people and other gimmicks. But so that political dilemma for local leaders, in my view, will delay the restarting of the economy.
Right. I think that was a critical point, and I wanted you to sort of stress on that issue because you're sort of bringing in the political dimension of recent leadership changes to the economic ramifications, and that's very, very interesting. Now, do you see the policy package, which, as you pointed out earlier, may not be as strong as everybody is expecting? There are moral hazard questions, there are debt overhang questions, and so on. But we've seen, or we generally think of the Chinese leadership as a very pragmatic leadership, sort of not necessarily ideological. If things need to be done, they'll do. As we saw in 2008, when ECB was still thinking about tightening policy, PBOC saw the writing on the wall and eased very, very dramatically. So you wouldn't expect them to be too dogmatic if things were to go south through the course of month of March.
Agreed.
Reaction function could be more aggressive.
Agreed. If need be, yes. But at the same time, targeting what was agreed, say in December in the Central Economic Work Conference doesn't make any sense either. So if you say, well, let's keep it reasonable, let's make sure that people stay employed, let's not get massive layoffs and massive bankruptcies. And once we've done that, let the economy recover on its own. It will bounce back on its own with or without stimulus once the virus issue is out of the way. And with that, you can still achieve quite a reasonable growth. With the quite dramatic -10 first quarter, you would still have 4.6% growth, even if you do nothing in terms of stimulus. Getting a stimulus done is also not so easy. If you're not really ready, and China, go back to 2008, China was ready. I can tell you China was ready. A year before, there was turbulence on the markets. We had lots of discussions with the government on what this would mean and what the risks are and how China can prepare for some things bad to happen. And then 2008, two really bad things happened, and after Lehman Brothers, they were ready with a stimulus. Now they're on the other foot, if you want. They've been trying to limit risk in the financial sector. They've been trying to reduce leverage. They've been only trying to play a little bit with local government bonds issue allowance, and so we've been very, very careful. So it's not that if you want, have a very big stimulus ready, because you need to be ready for that to make sense. So I think even if you would want, it's a bit harder to stage a very large stimulus at this point in time.
Sure. From a multilateral perspective, given your distinguished career at the World Bank, I mean, what role is Washington playing? And by that, I don't mean the White House. I mean the IMF, World Bank, in terms of, alerting the G20 members or emerging market governments about the fallout risk and so on.
Yeah, so that is it's largely outside China. I'm sure. WHO is at the forefront in China in offering help. But in terms of financial and economic preparation, China basically can do it by itself, whatever it wants to do. But preparing other countries for possible outbreaks, and then for possible economic actions to counter some of the fallout from China is important. People are very nervous about, yes, this disaster happened in China. But there's lots of countries that are at risk that have far weaker health systems, so there the impact of any spillover of the virus might be a lot more damaging. But also already the economic impact could already be felt at least around the region and to some extent in other parts of the world, including Africa. So what usually happens in situations like that is that there's conversations with the authorities to forewarn them, saying, look, this might actually come to your shores, be prepared. And then again talk about possible financial support. There's one particular financial support that the World Bank has, which is a pandemic insurance. Of course, it would now be expensive to buy the insurance, but a number of countries actually have a pandemic insurance. So in case that there is an outbreak, they would get liquidity quite soon from that facility.
Right. This issue was covered in your former colleague David Dollar's podcast, Dollar and Cents, recently, and it was a very, very illuminating one for me, indeed. Both catastrophic bond and pandemic bond are very interesting financial market solutions. But early days for these things, it seems like. Bert, I want to come back to the trade war issue for a second. China basically signed off on pledging to buy a lot of American products and also were sort of awarded by the Treasury and Department of Commerce removing the RMB from the watch list. Now the RMB has weakened sharply in the last few weeks. I can't really see China living up to the massive buying pledges. How does this turn out then?
Well, formally it turns out that there's one clause in the Phase 1 agreement that says if there is force majeure, we should talk. That's all it says. It doesn't say you can postpone your commitments or anything like that, but it says we should talk. There's been some tweeting to and fro, or Wilbur Ross came out saying, well, the coronavirus is actually good for the United States and it will bring a lot of jobs to the United States. That's a rather unfortunate statement. But there have been some noises from China saying, well, look, it would be reasonable to not expect the full 200 billion commitment for the 2 years, and so indicating that they want to talk about that. At the same time, they have been preparing for more imports because they've reduced the retaliatory tariffs on those categories for which they pledged more imports. Of course, if you recall, when the United States started to impose tariffs, China retaliated, especially with tariffs on agricultural goods and other goods, but especially agriculture. Now they promise to buy a lot of agriculture. So getting rid of those tariffs, actually, it's a rational thing to do. Otherwise, they would have to pay more because of their own tariffs. So that doesn't make much sense. But China has started to prepare in that sense for more imports. But it hasn't really happened yet because that's when first Chinese New Year and then the coronavirus happened.
Right. Bert, it's very easy to sort of fixate on the very short term, and of course, we will keep fixating on the coronavirus episode for months to come. But since I have you here, I'd like to spend the last few minutes of this podcast, take the broader view. China in general, a country characterized by aging, rising labor cost, more service sector orientation. That's the story of China for the last 5 years. It'll be the story for China for the next decade or two. This government, this leadership under Xi Jinping, what is your scorecard for them for work that has been done in terms of helping China recalibrate to these realities? And how much the trade war and all these other things gotten in the way, or that big ship to take the economy to the coming decades where it is more consumption-oriented, less investment-oriented, is that progressing, and are you confident it'll progress further?
Well, starting with that last part, in 2004, I and Louis Kuijs, one of the Dutch economists in the region as well, he's now the head of Oxford Economics, we wrote on a rebalancing of China's economy. We're now 16 years hence, and yes, there's been a tiny, tiny bit of rebalancing towards consumption. It's not going fast enough. And key reason is that if you want the well, there's two reasons. One is that the profit share in the economy is still quite high in China, and therefore the household share not as high. The second reason is that China's households still save a lot. Why do they save a lot? In part because the health system is not yet that good. You need to pay a lot out of pocket if you get sick, especially if you need operations. It becomes very expensive very quickly. So people prepare for that. Educating your child is becoming more and more expensive, not because the schools are expensive, but because what it takes to get your kid into a good school takes a lot of money. And third, your pensions, even though they have improved, are still not what you want them to be. And in a way, the urban pensions have become relatively less generous compared to the wages. Rural pensions are more generous. They used to be non-existent. Now they're at least in existence, but they're still fairly minimal. So the safety net in China is still relatively at its beginning, and therefore savings remain still high, which has an implication for the, if you want, the lack of rebalancing. In terms of reforms, well, there's the glass half empty and the glass half full people. I'm with the glass half full. I think actually quite a bit of reforms have happened, especially in the financial sector. Quite some in the fiscal sector, not perfect, but quite some in the fiscal sector, and the broader business environment in China, and that's not just the World Bank's doing business, but the broader sort of the realization that actually to be productive, to get more productive, to be more innovative, you need entrepreneurs, and that's China has realized. Was a big initiative announced by Premier Li Keqiang, and they followed up on that, and it's now become much easier. And you see the dynamism every time you go to China. You see the dynamism of new startups, enormous amounts of financing still available. It's less than maybe 3-4 years ago, but still, if you have a good idea, you can get it financed. And of course, the enormous amount of talent from an education system that brings more and more graduates on the market. And right now, almost 40% of the cohort goes to university. So if you want, yes, China is aging, but those people that are leaving the labor force are far less educated than those people that come into the labor force. So on net, the productivity is very clear. So the younger ones are so much more productive than the old ones leaving. Yes, aging is a challenge. Aging is a fiscal challenge. It's a pension fund challenge. But I don't think just counting the numbers in terms of the labor force that's not sufficient to characterize the problem. So, and then there is challenges. State enterprise reforms hasn't gone as far as many would hope for. I think they go in part in a direction that is not that useful. And they would have to go further. State enterprise is still very large, very diversified companies that are in sectors that you can't possibly see as strategic, and therefore they don't perform that well. Their rates of return are lower than private enterprises. Yes, there's some reasons for that, but at the same time, there's also state enterprises running hotels. They are running pure private services for no good reason. So that's where China has been lagging. Second, and that's a little bit where the trade tensions, if you want, play. I see a bit of a tension to look more at state and state-led solutions in the last 4 or 5 years. It's become much stronger since the United States has started to push, but it was already there. I mean, I think President Xi has different ideas about how an economy should be run than, say, a Premier Li Keqiang, who is far more market-oriented. The trade tensions have helped to some extent because it did open up China a little bit. China made its own reforms in the financial sector, in the joint ventures, and then in intellectual property. But at the same time, I think that the leadership thinks, well, we need to be prepared because we're weak we are exposed on the technology side, and the Huawei issue and the entities list made that very evident. So they're looking for a more status type of solution in some areas to be sure that they're not too vulnerable. So that's the balance, and it's difficult to see where that's going to end. I think if there is a relaxation on the trade front, i.e. there's good agreement, not just phase 1, but also the more difficult, hopefully coming phase 2, which will also imply WTO reforms, then you probably see a swing back to a more market-based policies in China. So let's hope for that.
Indeed. That's a critical issue. I heard somebody characterize the tech war as China's Sputnik moment, that when they realized that they cannot rely on the West's technology and supply side to keep their own security in place, because some of the companies are almost existential in nature as far as China's economic fabric are concerned. Bert, I'm really glad that we ended on that note because that sort of puts a slightly positive spin on an otherwise rather bleak scenario that we're encountering right now. very grateful to you for coming to us for our very first podcast. I hope you enjoyed your Kopi C. I see you drunk most of it, so you probably did. And thanks to our listeners for listening in, and we'll be back to you with one more Kopi with DBS in the next week or so.